In November 1918, the guns of World War I finally fell silent after 4 years of unprecedented destruction. Europe was left shattered, entire cities reduced to rubble, economies destroyed, and millions struggling to survive. Nearly 20 million soldiers and civilians were dead, leaving a generation scarred by loss and grief. In 1919, the victorious powers gathered in Paris to decide how the world would be rebuilt and who would be punished. Germany, blamed for starting the war, was excluded from negotiations and forced to accept whatever terms were imposed. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to secure peace, but instead it planted the seeds for another, even deadlier war. The Treaty of Versailles was not a simple peace agreement. It was a massive legal document, carefully written to reshape Europe and permanently weaken Germany after the war. At the heart of the treaty was Article 231, later known as the War Guilt Clause, a single sentence that would ignite decades of anger and resentment inside Germany. This clause forced Germany to accept full responsibility for starting World War I, blaming the nation alone for the destruction, suffering, and deaths of millions across Europe. Because Germany was declared guilty, it was ordered to pay enormous reparations to the victorious nations, amounts so extreme they drained the country's finances almost immediately. As money flowed out of Germany, factories slowed, jobs disappeared, and everyday citizens were pushed into poverty, struggling to afford food, fuel, and basic necessities. For many Germans, the Treaty of Versailles was not peace at all. It was humiliation, imposed without negotiation, leaving behind anger that would soon be exploited by extremists. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to surrender large portions of its territory, permanently altering its borders and weakening the nation's position in Europe. Key industrial and agricultural regions were taken away, stripping Germany of vital resources needed for recovery, trade, and long-term economic stability. Germany's army was reduced to just 100,000 men, forbidden from using tanks, aircraft, submarines, or modern heavy weapons. These limits left Germany unable to defend itself, creating fear and resentment among citizens who believed their nation had been deliberately left vulnerable. For millions of veterans, the treaty destroyed national pride, reducing former soldiers to symbols of defeat rather than sacrifice. Territory lost, military stripped, and dignity crushed, Germany became a nation simmering with anger, waiting for someone to promise revenge and restoration. By the early 1920s, Germany was trapped in an economic nightmare. The Treaty of Versailles demanded enormous reparations payments, yet the country's industry, infrastructure, and finances had been devastated by war. With little money and no realistic way to pay, the German government turned to printing more currency, believing it could solve the crisis by flooding the economy with paper money. Instead, hyperinflation spiraled out of control. Prices doubled within hours, wages became worthless overnight, and German money lost value so fast it was often carried in baskets. Families who had saved for decades saw their life savings vanish, while workers stood in long food lines, unsure if their money would buy even a single loaf of bread. As hunger and despair spread, anger filled the streets, protests erupted, strikes paralyzed cities, and trust in the government collapsed as people searched for someone to blame. Germany's fragile democracy began to crack under the pressure, creating the perfect conditions for radical voices, promising order, strength, and national revival to be heard. By the mid-1920s, millions of Germans were desperate for answers, blaming poverty, humiliation, and instability on the Treaty of Versailles and the politicians who accepted it. In this climate of anger and fear, extremist movements gained attention by offering simple explanations, bold promises, and clear enemies to blame for Germany's suffering. Among these voices was Adolf Hitler, a powerful speaker who blamed Germany's defeat not on war, but on betrayal and humiliation imposed by Versailles. Hitler's message focused relentlessly on the treaty, promising to destroy Versailles, restore German honor, rebuild the military, and reclaim lost territory at any cost. To many struggling Germans, these speeches offered hope, pride, and direction, while quietly replacing reason with rage and unity with hatred. What began as anger toward a treaty slowly transformed into loyalty to a movement, setting Germany on a dangerous path toward dictatorship and war. By 1933, Germany's political chaos reached a turning point when Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising to undo the Treaty of Versailles and restore national strength. Almost immediately, Germany began secretly violating the treaty, rebuilding its army in defiance of strict limits placed on its military forces. Despite being forbidden from having an air force, Germany created the Luftwaffe, signaling that the rules imposed at Versailles were no longer being respected. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a direct violation of the treaty and one that met no military resistance from Britain or France. The lack of response convinced Hitler that the treaty's enforcers were unwilling to act, encouraging further aggression without fear of immediate punishment. Step by step, Germany dismantled the Treaty of Versailles, replacing diplomacy with force and setting Europe on an irreversible path toward another global war. By 1933, Germany's political chaos reached a turning point when Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising to undo the Treaty of Versailles and restore national strength. Almost immediately, Germany began secretly violating the treaty, rebuilding its army in defiance of strict limits placed on its military forces. Despite being forbidden from having an air force, Germany created the Luftwaffe, signaling that the rules imposed at Versailles were no longer being respected. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a direct violation of the treaty and one that met no military resistance from Britain or France. The lack of response convinced Hitler that the treaty's enforcers were unwilling to act, encouraging further aggression without fear of immediate punishment. Step by step, Germany dismantled the Treaty of Versailles, replacing diplomacy with force and setting Europe on an irreversible path toward another global war.